to see. I remember where I was going with this. Just to wrap the show up, I often thought it would be fun to do a show on conspiracy theories and to say which ones are completely untrue, impossible, which ones are unlikely, and which ones are actually open possibilities. For example, the Loch Ness Monster is impossible. Bigfoot is exceedingly unlikely, but not demonstrably impossible in the way that an air-breathing plesiosaur that never comes up for air is. The Loch Ness Monster is demonstrably impossible. The Apollo moon landing conspiracy is demonstrably impossible. All you have to do is look at the dust coming off of the rover. You know, why would you, if you went once, if it was a fake and you went once for Apollo 11, why would you go again? And why on earth would you bring a wheeled vehicle that would let you cover miles and miles and miles of this interior, perfectly lit studio? It just doesn't make any sense at all. The idea that the moon landing is faked is absolutely absurd on its face. You just look at the dust that comes off of the astronaut shoes or off of the rover, and you'll see that the dust sprays like water, and it sprays like water in a 1/6 gravity field, and it doesn't form clouds, and that will not do it anywhere other than on a low gravity field in a vacuum. And anybody that knows anything will tell you it is easier to go to the moon than it is to make a perfect vacuum in an area the size of a gigantic stadium. But again, it doesn't make sense. Why would you go back to the moon with a car and explore all of these incredible areas if you were trying to fake it? Why? Doesn't make any sense. So the moon landing is absolutely true. The Loch Ness Monster is absolutely false. The idea that the World Trade Center was brought down by controlled explosions is absolutely false. It's not false because there's not enough evidence for it. It's false on its face. It is logically impossible. The whole 9/11 conspiracy thing is logically impossible. But one thing that I'll give you that just is pretty compelling example is, people say it was brought down by an explosion. What makes you say that? Well, you can see the thing coming out of the floors. You can see the explosion. It's like, that's not explosives. There's no flash of light in there. It's, as a floor comes down, it's compressing that floor and it's blowing the air out through the windows. That's all it is. No, it was brought down by controlled explosions. Okay, here's the deal. Have you ever seen a building brought down by explosions? Have you ever seen anybody actually so-called implode a building before? Yeah, I see it on Discovery Channel. Okay, I've seen it on Discovery Channel too. First of all, the tallest buildings that they've done that for is 40 or 50 stories. They're not 100 stories, but put that aside because that's not terribly relevant. When you prepare a building to be imploded, brought down by explosives, it takes months because you don't just put a sack of dynamite in the corner and blow it up. In order to do this, to bring a building vertically straight down, you have to first of all remove all of the walls, all of the drywall, all of the asbestos, all of the wood, all of that insulation. It all has to come off, and you have to get in there, and you have to get to the actual steel support beams, and then you have to weld holes in these steel support beams and place these exquisitely designed shaped charges in such a way that when it blows, it's going to cut through the steel beam. And they all have to go off simultaneously if you want to bring it straight down and create a small footprint as possible. And so in order to prep a 20-story building, this takes 2 or 3 months. In order to prep a 100-story building would probably take 6 months. And in order to prep 200-story buildings, it would take a year. And when you bring one of these buildings down through controlled explosions, you will see hundreds, if not more, lines of detonation cord coming out of this. And that when they fire that thing off, you'll see that these things go right down the detonation cords, go up into the various parts of the thing. They have to be timed exactly right, and boom. So my question is, if it turns out it was brought down by a controlled explosion, and since the World Trade Center is open 24 hours a day, and since this was a Tuesday, and since the people had been at work on Monday, are you trying to tell me that 2 or 3 guys in black cat suits were able to rig both buildings in 24 hours? Who am I kidding, 24 hours? In 8 hours while people are gone? That they were able to pull all of this stuff off of all the walls and then plant these charges and then hide the det cord where? Where do the detonation cords get hidden? Do they get hidden in the walls? Do they get hidden under the carpets? Everything has to be put back in place. No dust on the floor, on every one of the floors, on both buildings. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And there's no reason to have this theory. It's not like there's not another theory. My theory is a couple of Muslims hijacked a plane and flew a giant flying fuel tank into a building, and then after a couple hours, it came down. And by the way, since I finally got a little religion here, I'm a little wound up. I had an argument with somebody who was a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, and you know what I said that actually convinced them? They said, I never thought about that. That's actually, I think you got a good case here. It was so simple that it really surprised me, because I thought you really had to get into the whole thing. I'll get to WT World Trade Center 7 if somebody wants to know for a second. But what I said to them was, no, the most compelling and obvious evidence that it's true is this. The building that got hit first lasted the longest. The building that got hit second went down first. Why is that? Well, as it turns out, the building that got hit first got hit higher up, and the building that got hit second got hit lower. And that's why it went down first, because the building that got hit second, when the plane went in, went then 20 or 30 stories lower, which meant that there's 30 stories more of weight above the second impact than there was above the first impact. And since there's that much more weight above the fault area, there's that much more downward pressure on the fault line, and that's why it collapsed first. And she said, that actually makes a lot of sense. I never really thought of it that way. No one's ever said that before. Of course not, because it's perfectly logical. Perfectly logical. Somebody said, well, what about World Trade Center 11? It collapsed on its own. I'm going to do a conspiracy show because I just like getting into this frame of mind. It collapsed on its own. You remember after the towers came down and the outside sheets of the World Trade Center were that kind of corrugated vertical thing, and that sticking into the ground were these giant forks of tons and tons and tons of steel that had embedded themselves vertically into the ground as this giant thing came down. Well, when you bring 100 stories, 200 stories of buildings with the kind of surface down, the building next to it is going to take extreme damage. It's going to take severe damage. And they've had videos of fires that were burning in World Trade Center 7 since the moment the first attack started. And you combine that kind of damage and that kind of fire, when you think about essentially 200 stories of concrete scissors coming down on a building, it's not inconceivable that the building would collapse. And by the way, the firemen went in there and said, this building is not safe. It's not going to last. Let's get out of here. And several hours later, down it went. So where was the dead cord in there? Where was all this stuff? It's just absolutely ridiculous. Ridiculous. No, 9/11 was not an inside job. We did land on the moon. There is no Loch Ness Monster. There almost certainly is no Bigfoot, but you can't disprove Bigfoot the way you can disprove the Loch Ness Monster. The Fed may, in fact, have been created by dark forces, and there may, in fact, be dark forces running our money supply. I think it's unlikely, but it's certainly possible. It is well in the realm of possibility. UFOs are exceedingly unlikely. It just doesn't seem to pass the smell test. There is, by the way, the best evidence against Bigfoot is the fact that the best picture of Bigfoot was a fake. The best picture of him, the only real picture of him, was a fake. What does that tell you? UFOs as a vehicle for extraterrestrial intelligence, I think chance that's about zero. Pretty much zero. I can't prove that it's zero. The theory could be correct. I can't disprove it, but I don't have to disprove it. The evidence for it is minuscule. All of the best UFO pictures were fake. The only really good picture of the Loch Ness Monster was fake. What does that tell you? But I cannot disprove UFOs, but I don't have to disprove it. Life is simple, and you're going to have to prove that it actually is something, and you can't prove that they exist. Crop circles don't prove anything. They just don't prove anything. They prove that somebody can go out there with a piece of wood and a string and stamp down wheat. That's all that proves. So I just think that's an interesting thing, this idea of comparing conspiracy theories. And the reason I think it's interesting is because it does give you some good exercise at weighing logic and weighing evidence. Is there evidence for UFOs? Yes, there's a series of photographs. Is there other evidence? There's circles on the ground. Okay, let's start looking at the photographic evidence. Turns out that the photographic evidence is poor, virtually non-existent. It turns out that the circles are fake, and most of the pictures are fake. It tells me that it doesn't exist. That's not to say that people don't see things that they genuinely believe don't exist in the sky. I think I told you, I've said it a bunch of times before. It's really one of my favorite stories, though, because it woke me up an awful lot. I actually believed in UFOs quite a bit. In 1977, we did a show in Planetarium about, in conjunction with the releasing of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And during a period of about a year or two there, I thought, it's really real, and we're going to see them, because that movie was so compelling. I had friends who were astronomers, junior astronomers, who went out into the Everglades and said they saw lights moving at right angles and stuff. And so they said, come on out. And I went out, and we sat there all night and didn't see anything. And just at the last minute, literally, as the sun was coming up and it was starting to get bright in the sky, this guy said, there it is. And I'm looking at it. I said, that's a satellite. He says, don't you see it moving left and right? I said, it's not moving left and right, Tony. It's moving in a perfectly straight line. Just hysteria. My favorite part was being on the observatory roof and seeing these V-shape of oval flying saucers appear over Miami. I mean, just look up in the sky, and there's these V of 7 on a side, ovals, glowing ovals, flying in formation overhead. I saw it. Everybody else on the roof of the observatory saw it. There were probably 30 of us that saw it. And people were screaming. They were simply screaming. They were like, they were out of their minds. They'd seen a leprechaun, and there he was. And I wasn't the one who found it. I wish I had, but somebody said, no, they're geese. I said, what? I said, no, look, if you look carefully, you can see they're geese. And sure enough, once you started looking at it carefully, you could see that what you were seeing was the white bellies of geese that were being lit from all of the streetlights in Miami. But if you look carefully, you could in fact see the much darker wings and the much darker neck, and they were in fact a flock of geese flying over Miami. And when I pointed it out to people, they lost their minds. They just hated me for it. So UFOs, no, I don't think so. Somebody mentioned the TWA flight. Was it 400 or 800, whatever? See, now that's an example. Not an unreasonable guy. TWA flight has some evidence that seems to be convincing, but the main thing is there's nothing in the theory that it was shot down by a missile that is impossible on its side, on its own. There's nothing impossible inherent in the theory that it was brought down by a surface-to-air missile. I think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And it is much more likely than the idea that aliens from another planet came here in vehicles the size of a Volkswagen bus, and one of them flew into a hill in Roswell, New Mexico, and left as much wreckage as an exploded Jiffy Pop can. You know, so the TWA flight evidence is much better. I still don't think it's compelling, but I don't know much about that one. So yeah, I'm open-minded to that. Anybody else have anything else they want to toss out? I just don't think that this is, to me it's fun. It's fun trying to figure out what could be true, what is true, and what is clearly not true. And frankly, that's a skill that you might want to have in the world, because that certainly informs my politics. And there we go. Now, Aesop just said, why do aliens need to be from another planet? That's actually a very astute question. It's a very astute question. It's such an astute question that we realized that by saying what I said, I built in assumptions into the statement. There's been some talk that UFOs are the result of time travelers from this planet. But again, it takes an awful lot more complexity to imagine time travelers flying through the skies when so many of these pictures have been faked and so many of them are just distant objects. And I think this is very compelling too, is that during the 1900s there were reports all across the world in the country of ghost dirigibles that weren't there. People saw blimps in the sky at night. And then earlier than that, there were talks about people seeing flying chariots or weird things like that. It's interesting how the evolution of the visions changed as the actual technology around the witnesses changed. I think that's a fairly compelling case that they imagined it. And when I say imagined it, I don't mean that in a bad way. Somebody asked about leprechauns, and I'll close this because I've been talking way too much, and you've heard all this before anyway. But anyway. When I say imagined it, I don't mean they're crazy, and I don't mean that they're lying. Some of them are clearly lying. The people that make the phony, the surgeon's photo of the Loch Ness Monster, that guy carved a miniature Loch Ness Monster, put it out in the water, took a picture of it. He's obviously lying. The person that made the Bigfoot suit of the Bigfoot looking over his shoulder with a zipper in it, that person's lying. The people that make false footprints of Bigfoot are lying. Those people are lying, but most people are probably seeing things that they can't explain. And there's a lot of things out there that are tough to explain. It's an interesting litmus test for your ability to look at things skeptically, and to make decisions about what's true and what's not in the physical world. But yeah, the idea that maybe, again, AesopsRetreat says we have no idea of who lives in the deep parts of the oceans. True, but there's no evidence at all, none, zero, that there is a second intelligent technological society at the bottom of the ocean. We've been to the bottom of the ocean, I don't know, we've explored 1/400th of the bottom of the ocean. So you can make a case that, yes, there's an awful lot of unexplored stuff out there, but you can also make the case that, it's not provably false, but there's no evidence for it. We haven't gone to the bottom of the ocean and ever seen anything to give us an indication that there was anything other than mud down there, ever. And so why would I believe that there are a second intelligent, super intelligent race living underneath the ocean? I can't prove it's not real, but I don't have to. I can't prove that my cat doesn't go to Venus every night and a flying saucer picks him up at the window, flies him out to Venus, and he roams around out there a little bit and orbits the planet, comes back, and is always in bed in time by the time I wake up. I can't prove that didn't happen, but I don't have to. Atlantis. Victoria asked about Atlantis. Now, Atlantis is fascinating. Atlantis is a great one because Atlantis, I think, is pretty clearly a convergence of wishful, magical thinking, but combined with some kind of historical cause. Best explanation of Atlantis that I've ever heard was that the Atlantis myth is based on the island of Thera, which is now called, I think, Santorino or Santorino. There is a volcanic caldera in the Aegean Sea. It's a crescent, and it used to be a cone. And when this thing blew up, it blew it up. Damn you, you blew it up. It made Krakatoa look like a firecracker. Made Pompeii and Vesuvius look like a firecracker. This entire island just exploded because it was a volcanic island, and it was in the Aegean. And the idea of a giant flood and the idea of a giant rain of fire and of a civilization disappearing beneath the waves has some evidence behind it. It wasn't, there's no evidence that it was this advanced civilization, but people lived there, I'm sure. So there's something behind that. I don't think it's this mysterious thing. And by the way, since we're on this subject, and since we're probably going to just push this until I'm tired of it, because it's a nice thing about having your own show. What does it say when people have to invoke anti-gravity and flying saucers and other miracles, including space aliens, to explain the Great Pyramids of Giza or the pyramids the Incas made or any of that stuff? What does it say about somebody who has to invoke those things? If somebody came to this planet from a vastly superior civilization to the one that we live in now, you would think that if they wanted to leave a remember me by, they could do better than a giant pile of rocks. One of my favorite essays ever, I turned it into a video, but it was one of my favorite essays ever was to compare a 7-Eleven with the Great Pyramid of Giza. And how the 7-Eleven, a standard routine one of 10,000 7-Elevens, that any given 7-Eleven is orders and orders and orders of magnitude more impressive than the pyramids. A 7-Eleven has electricity, it's got glass, it's got air conditioning, it's got Oreo cookies, it has aspirin, it has a TV camera, it's got a laser scanning device to pick up your prices on the things. It's got microphones and television and telephones. It's got on printed paper news from around the world that existed only a day ago, and if the guy's got an internet connection, it's information that happened seconds ago. It's got Snickers bars. It's lit at night. A 7-Eleven in every single way is much, much, much more impressive than a giant pile of rocks. It's just absolutely orders of magnitude more complex than a big pile of rocks. It's an impressive pile of rocks. I don't want to take anything away from the guys that made it. It took, generations, and it's impressive, but it is a pile of rocks. And the idea that we have to invoke flying saucers and aliens and anti-gravity beams to explain the pile of rocks? Really? Come on. It's got Slurpees, exactly right. T-Dog Lyle says it's got Slurpees. It's got cherry Slurpees, and that closes the argument as far as I'm concerned. So there you go. It's amazing. Yeah, I talked about Pharaoh going to a 7-Eleven and just how spooked Pharaoh would be by the idea that he could stand behind a piece of glass. He'd never seen glass before. And the idea that Pharaoh could stand behind the door or behind one of the windows in the 7-Eleven and have servants throw water at him and have him flinch and have the water just be arrested in midair, just stopped in midair by something, and then slide down would be beyond his comprehension. I talked about having aspirin. Most of these, the Egyptians, I did a planetarium show. Jack Horkheimer did a planetarium show. He picked up some mummies. He's an odd guy, that Jack. He really was an amazingly eclectic guy. He bought a couple of mummies, and he bought them for the planetarium in the Museum of Science. So we had these 2 actual Egyptian mummies outside in the lobby, and he did a show on Egyptian astronomy. But since he's such a natural showman, he took the mummies down and had them x-rayed. And typical, you find all the things you would expect to find from primitive peoples, pretty poor nutrition and kind of bad scoliosis on one of them, certainly, and all these other things. But one thing he found out, and I'd never heard it before, I'm not saying he discovered it, but one thing he discovered was that both of these mummies had incredible abscesses in their jaws where their teeth were. That what was left of their teeth were just stumps, and that they had enormous holes in their jaw where infection and abscess had continued for years and years and years and years and years. And when Jack started investigating that, what he found out was that the Egyptians living in a desert ingested so much sand that sand got into the baking of every loaf of bread that they ate. That every time they took some wheat and laid it out and rolled it and baked it, that sand was getting in there, and they basically were eating sandpaper. And over the course of time, they eroded their teeth enamel down, and some of these people probably died of toothaches. They probably died of them. I mean, horrific physical evidence of these jaw abscesses from what must have been 10, 15 years of just daily agony. And to go to a 7-Eleven, Pharaoh would go to a 7-Eleven and have an aspirin, and to come out of pain for a little while, or even have it reduced. I mean, what would he pay for that? He'd kill legions to get that. Kill legions to give his son a Snickers bar, a Coca-Cola. So anyway, I like these kind of thought experiments. I like them a lot. I think they're really fun. And I think at this point I'm going to call this one a day.